Hello everybody and welcome to the channel Out of Ammo, Out of Time. I'm your host, KrabbyTerror8, and as many of you will know, the past 18 months I've been playing The Gathering with every investigator in Arkham Horror, the card game. So even though the investigator games have moved on to Season 2, The Midnight Masks, I wanted to draw a line under the series so far and offer my in-depth analysis of The Gathering as a kind of farewell kiss of sorts, as a kind of a thanks for all the memories of The Gathering. Now, just a quick spoiler warning that applies here to The Gathering, of course, but also to The Circle Undone, especially the Witching Hour, which I will be using as a contrast and comparison. You have been warned. So anyway, there's that. So without further ado, let's look at The Gathering now, shall we? I call this series the Investigator Games because, well, like the Hunger Games, I wanted to throw every investigator into The Gathering with their starter deck and see how they'd go. Now, over the past 18 months, it's been high drama with dramatic wins. I'm looking at you, Safina, at the top of the table, and of course, terrible failures. I'm looking at you, Calvin and Zoe, at the bottom. But I have to say that playing the same scenario over so many weeks, I now feel like I really know this scenario. As well, seeing how the investigators manage the scenario gives me some insight into them and of course the dynamics that are at play in The Gathering. Because in this video I intend to discuss all the key aspects of The Gathering, the lore and the story, the scenario design and the gameplay experience, how different investigators and classes of investigators managed in this scenario, and finally my verdict on The Gathering. Along the way, I'll also share with you what others thought of this scenario, and hopefully by the end we can walk away feeling like we know The Gathering from top to bottom. So let's dive in, shall we, with Chapter 1, Lore and Story. The Ghoul's Hunger. Friday, September 18, 1925. Arkham, Massachusetts. It's the end of a long and abnormally hot summer. The first hints of autumn beckon, but a heavy heat persists. Relentless. A silent, unspoken anger grips the town. Tempers are short, and in just the last week alone, there have been numerous reports of townspeople coming to heated, violent blows with one another over simple misunderstandings. And now, a call from James Hankerson. He claims to have found a dismembered body in his barn. Blaming the weather would be too easy. There's something wrong with this town, and not a whole lot this old soothsayer can do to stop the slide. My auguries indicate a small group of investigators will soon take note of these strange happenings and set forth to make things right. I'll be watching their progress, but I won't be holding my breath. Whilst no scenario or campaign in Arkham Horror the Living card game is compulsory, you can of course play any scenario from any cycle in any order at any time. It is likely that practically everybody would have experienced The Gathering at some stage and would have started by reading the introduction to the campaign entitled The Ghoul's Hunger. This is an interesting introduction for a number of reasons. Firstly, no other campaign guide begins narratively like this. In all other cases so far, the other cycles begin with a series of lines from published works by Lovecraft or Robert W. Chambers, someone like that. The other introductions function to anchor the campaign within the literary tradition from which the game and the campaign has sprung, which give the reader a taste of things to come, but also provides the reader with a pointer to further reading for those interested in the lore which underpins this particular campaign. Not so with The Gathering. Now, it could have started that way with a quotation about ghouls from Pickman's model, for example, but it feels here that the introduction functions quite differently. Firstly, it points to the scope and intention of this first campaign, The Night of the Zealot. Here there's less of a sweeping scope of a full campaign. It's a more modest starting point which befits the fact that there are only 3 scenarios in total. So why not anchor this as the prologue to The Gathering? Interestingly, this passage is very different from what we've become used to, because it's not written from the point of view of an omniscient, unknown narrator, but instead we come to understand that this is the narration of this old soothsayer, a first-person narrative. This person, this old soothsayer, appears to be watching and predicting what will come. But who is this old soothsayer? Is it Leader Chandler? Is this the Fantasy Flight game devs? Is it us, the piloting players? Whoever it is, this character is never referred to again, and it's unclear how they're related to the one referred to the Zealot in the title. The best explanation is, of course, that this exposition is Leader Chandler. She is the old soothsayer, and she is also the Zealot. Now, not everybody might agree with this, but let me explain further. Lita is of course Zealot traded, which must mean this is her night. In a way, she's the chief protagonist in this narrative. Throughout this campaign, Lita is a key reason for action. She is the prime motivator the investigators' actions are based on, and her fate is ultimately tied to the outcomes of the campaign. The old soothsayer is also tied to this campaign in a profound manner. This character has in-depth knowledge of what has been occurring, has been taking a direct interest in the town, and is watching and observing the investigators. These interests directly align with Lita's, of course. If you think about it, Lita is strangely present and absent in The Gathering, hiding behind a magic barrier in your own home. She doesn't get involved until you destroy her barrier. Angry, she gets involved, but it never feels like she does this willingly. So what are her intentions and motivations? This is referred to later in the campaign, that they are ambiguous at best. And like the old soothsayer, she's both involved but apart, watching yet not participating. Now, even if I haven't convinced you with that, I think I would say finally, who else could be the old soothsayer? I mean, I suppose it could be nobody, but that would be strange. There is no one else. It's possible that they are a separate character, but then why introduce them at all? No, I think it's pretty clear that Leader Chandler, at least on the balance of evidence, is the old soothsayer at the start, which raises, I guess, as many questions as it answers. But she plays an important and unique role because The Gathering and this campaign is different to other campaigns. The Gathering and Night of the Zealot is really an extended tutorial level. Now, this is important because tutorial levels are common in video games. Most video games have a starting level, which introduces new players to the lore. You know, the ideas and the mechanics which form the scaffold of the game's structure, and how you as the player navigate this structure through time and space in a way that's meaningful and is understandable. As many of you would know who play video games, it's not uncommon for a character to be involved in these tutorial journeys. The old man in the opening area of Breath of the Wild functions in this way, both separate and involved, both watching and participating. This character aids the player playing Link in the navigation of the world at the earliest stages of the game. I like to call this kind of character the tutorial psychopomp. Now, when I use the word tutorial psychopomp, what the hell am I talking about? Well, as many of you would know, A psychopomp is classically defined as a being who ushers the dead into the underworld or the afterlife. A popular example is Charon, the ferryman, who must be paid to cross the river Styx, as we can see in these pictures below. Psychopomps, though, come in many forms. Whippoorwills are in fact psychopomps, but they are always observers and facilitators rather than active participants. Now, video game tutorial psychopomps operate in a similar manner. They're often a disinterested character whose role is to observe, to provide suggestions, and to motivate the new player into action, and therefore help the player become acquainted with the core elements of the game. In this manner, they usher new players into the game world. Lita Chandler, the old soothsayer, ally, and zealot, is in this way a tutorial psychopomp. Her role motivates new players to act. She imbues new players with the confidence and authority to move forward, and at the same time remains somewhat uninvolved for most of the campaign. This introduction is really unique, as we said. It's a unique beginning. It foreshadows Lita as a tutorial psychopomp in the form of the old soothsayer, and it established the gathering as a tutorial scenario. This is a really important element of the gathering and the Night of the Zealot campaign, which cannot be overlooked in any analysis.
So on to the gathering proper. Ghouls play a significant role in the Lovecraft mythos. The Lovecraft wiki has a pretty comprehensive outline of where the ghouls have been featured. Pickman's model is the first scenario of ghouls being described, and indeed this features on the Ghoul minion text which accompanies the gathering. Ghouls also are strongly linked to the Dreamlands, and on the excellent site yogsothoth.com there is a reference to the following. Ghouls are found through the underworld of the Dreamlands as well, and it seems that they can navigate between the waking world and the Dreamlands through the use of special tunnels. This is a perfect explanation as to what's happening in the gathering, where what begins as a normal domestic environment of a study rapidly expands in a dreamlike manner into a multi-dimensional nightmare of disappearing doors, rooms into other worlds, and tunnels beneath the floor. This experience for the investigator parallels the experience for the newly minted player, who begins play at a table in their home and is quickly invited into the new gameplay experience, which expands the imagination beyond the boundaries of the domestic and out into a world where anything is possible. After the gathering, the game is saying to the player, things will never be the same again. Now, there are some jarring inconsistencies in this story from the get-go, however, which many a campaign or role player has attempted to try and square away, but never really works. Solo players are confronted with the words, "You are gathered at the lead investigator's home to discuss these bizarre events," which of course doesn't make sense, and for some investigators the idea of having a home at all borders on the bizarre, especially for survivors such as Wendy and Pete, for example, who are unlikely to have any property at all. But equally, Jenny Barnes or Preston are just as unlikely to own such a humble dwelling, at least that's the way it looks in the pictures. This can lead to some rather hilarious unintended consequences from a story roleplay perspective, such as Wendy and Preston are squatting in this house they found for the night. Should I burn down a house that I don't even own? Well, why not? This is a small thing though, because the great thing about the gathering is that the story unfolds in a way which feels organic and manageable for newer players. This is important because, as we said, the gathering operates somewhat like a tutorial section of a video game. Like the best tutorial levels in video games, the gathering manages to tick all the right boxes from a story perspective. The story is streamlined and focused without coming across as simplistic. The story introduces to the players what they might expect moving forward, especially the tension which is set up narratively between the competing agenda and act decks. And finally, the story concludes in such a way that it leaves the player wanting to know more. It has narrative drive and compels the player to move on to the next scenario. Bigstupidgrin talks about the story. He says, it works well as an introduction to the game because the story is pretty simple and straightforward. Spooky things are happening in Arkham. You and your friends are there to solve it. Before you begin, you have a combined 4 paragraphs in the campaign log, along with an act and an agenda to read. Not much of the mystery gets explained to you until you earn that through the gameplay. Vase Odin from Twisted Tentacle also comments on the scenario and says the scenario does a fantastic job of showcasing the narrative nature of the game. It certainly does. Reading the flavor text as you play can be very rewarding. It's a great introduction to the game. Nate from Lost in Time and Space says, the Gathering serves as an excellent introduction to Arkham Horror, the card game. It teaches the basics of the game in a fun and engaging way through the use of narrative and game mechanics that complement each other well. I couldn't agree more. So let's talk about something different now, which is the scenario design. The concept of an agenda and an act deck as presenting competing narratives which determine how the story will unfold is, as far as I know, unique to this game. It is fundamental to the way players interact with the story. In The Gathering, we the players explore a house which is literally shifting before our very eyes as the ghoul infestation becomes more and more intense. In a way, the story in The Gathering is a perfect microcosm of every story which has followed to date. Namely, try to stay ahead of the agenda by exploring to better understand the situation, which inevitably culminates in some kind of showdown, usually with a powerful being. In this case, of course, the Ghoul Priest. The Gathering then perfectly tutors and prepares the player for what will come, not only at the end of the Night of the Zealot, but indeed at the end of every scenario into the future. Indeed, it's testament to The Gathering that even after playing this scenario more than 50 times, I still get engaged with the story and feel the tension build as we reach the climax, the terrifying encounter with the Ghoul Priest. The scenario for The Gathering is unique in one important respect, which again is similar to a tutorial section of a video game, namely to gradually expose the player or players to the core game mechanics. This is done expertly in the sense that the complexity builds as the scenario progresses, so that by the end of the scenario, most players will have a good understanding of the core mechanics, and importantly how the game expresses such mechanics through its own unique jargon, and then physically alters the board state as a consequence. This stepped approach to communication through the agenda and act deck and the printed details on the location cards allows players to become familiar with how the game imposes changes to the board state, which exemplify the impact of the mythos upon the world and the investigators. So when combined with the encounter and player cards, it sets up a complex dynamic, which means that the plot within the story of The Gathering and the broader Night of the Zealot are never the same twice. The book, if you like, is literally being rewritten every single time. I think Nate from Lost in Time and Space really summarizes it nicely here. As you make your way through the scenario, you begin to realize the game is out to get you and will stop at nothing to achieve its goal. The Gathering, and the rest of the game for that matter, encapsulates the essence of Arkham Horror in a unique way that is best explained through personal experience. And this makes Arkham Horror, the living card game, very different from other story-driven games. At one end of the spectrum, you have your choose-your-own-adventure type games, which might appear on the surface to function in a similar manner to Arkham Horror, the living card game, but in reality are limited in their possible outcomes. There are only so many paths that a book can take before it becomes unwieldy. And whilst digital-based narrative games have more complexity to them, they still work essentially the same, which is a story on rails, where the interaction is really just to choose which rails to go on to see the outcome. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, are the physical role-playing games, which are truly open-ended and have the potential to have so many possible outcomes depending upon so many dynamics, the player, the GMs, just creativity. Essentially, this makes them one-off games which really don't work as a replayable scenario in the strictest sense. Arkham Horror, the living card game, sort of sits in this in-between space, where scenarios are to some degree on a predictable path, but the path is extremely variable given the interaction between the player's decisions, the investigators and their abilities, and of course the encounter deck itself, and the act and the agenda deck as we discussed. So this complex interaction is perhaps closer to playing a competitive team sport more than anything. Because in a sport, the scenario is predictable. It has predictable points like a start and a half time and a full time. There are a set of rules and guidelines. And everything else is a complex composition of how your team, or your investigators if you like, and their cards, interacts with the board, which is like a pitch, and against the competitive team, which in the case of Arkham Horror the card game are the encounter cards. So this stepped approach to making new players aware of all of these dynamics is really handled in an excellent way. The scenario begins in only one location, which helps keep the mechanics fairly contained at the start. Investigators at the start are really focused on one thing: finding clues to get out of the study. This first act, therefore, teaches the core mechanics of shroud and clues and investigation. It also teaches you that finding clues is the most important thing in the game, as without the clues, the investigators are trapped both physically in the game and mechanically in terms of the board state. Now, this can be a problem for those playing true solo, I should know, especially the hapless noob who decides, say, to start with Agnes with 2 intellect, and then goes ahead and draws no flashlights, no perceptions, no look what I found, and might actually spend significant amount of time trying to get out of the study. But assuming most get out reasonably quickly, the act unlocks 3 locations so that new players can then learn new rules around movement, varying shroud locations, and importantly, something that I still need to learn, reading the details on location cards carefully, as they often detail additional effects. The gathering in the second act is therefore wonderfully symmetrical, with the hallway acting as a midpoint between the horror-inducing but easy to investigate attic and the damage-inducing and hard to investigate cellar. WingingIt has some great thoughts on how investigators can better manage the cellar and its dreaded full shroud. For the full shroud location, if you don't have naturally high intellect like Daisy does, you'll need some tech to beat it. Roland can wait to kill enemies here there for clues. Working a hunch works regardless of shroud, and Wendy can use something like look what I found. And flashlight and perception are always helpful. The main thing is you want to give yourself the best odds when you take the tests, and not test an even when you're throwing resources into the test. The encounter deck itself is an excellent tutorial in nasty effects which can befall the investigators. Everything is here: monsters, impacts on doom count, nasty impacts on the investigators' health and sanity, impacts on the shroud value of locations. Who hasn't lamented drawing an obscuring fog in the cellar, and even takes away vital tools and assets in the form of the dreaded crypt chill. The third and final act is where I have some criticism, mainly for new players. The difficulty curve in terms of learning the game suddenly spikes in the third act, with so much to take in and do. No wonder new players can get somewhat flummoxed here. At the end of Act 2, when you throw in the 3 clues, a lot happens all at once before the next investigation phase. Lita and the Ghoul Priest are spawned, the parlour is revealed. It's entirely possible that the agenda deck also advances, and then the poor hapless new player has to remember to draw another encounter card as well after all that in the mythos phase. Is it any wonder that the very important text on the parlour can be lost or forgotten in the cognitive overload of the third act? Could this have been perhaps a smoother ride?
Many others also made a comment about the complexity spike which hits at the end of Act 2.
Vase Odin of the legendary Twisted Tentacle in channel said, "New players may misinterpret how the boss spawns and the implications of that. Lita is another bit of complexity. Some forget that you can parlay without provoking opportunity attacks from an engaged creature." Bigstupidgrin also pointed out this important point about the complexity spike. He says, "It does escalate quite a bit with the Ghoul Priest, and that's my main criticism of the Gathering. The Ghoul Priest can be a beginner's trap for players as you spawn it on top of you after Act 2. It can't be easily evaded, and it does a massive amount of damage and horror and has retaliate. You can easily lose your first run of this because you weren't expecting such a powerful enemy to spawn on top of you." WingingIt also mentioned this, so it clearly is a key piece with the Gathering, and he says for new players it can be a bit daunting, especially when the Ghoul Priest comes out. Once you have some experience under your belt, it's generally a pretty quick and easy run. The main choke points are the Four Shroud location and the Ghoul Priest. Now, perhaps if investigators discover the Parlour and Lita, and the Ghoul Priest only arrives at Agenda 3, that might have smoothed the curve somewhat. I suppose spawning the Ghoul Priest at the end of the round does give investigators the full 3 actions on their next turn, so there is that, unless of course they draw the dreaded Frozen in Fear, which has happened to all of us at some time. Now, the other rather frustrating aspect of the Gathering is the uniquely, I think, rather random nature of the ability to gain victory points in this first scenario, which is important because it is a tutorial scenario. Now, the idea of victory points that are converted to experience points in Arkham Horror the Living Card game is a sound one. It's a tried and tested formula borrowed from role-playing games. The main idea is that through effort and expertise and repetitive effort, the investigators come to understand the mythos better and their skills better, and they become better at countering it. And this is reflected in their ability to upgrade assets and personal abilities in order to fend off future horrors. The Gathering as a tutorial level misses this somewhat because of the challenge of gaining the full complement of 6 victory points, which is then converted to 8 experience points. To do that, it's highly dependent on gaining 2 random draws which spawn the Flesh Eater and the Icy Ghoul. Now, the likelihood of both of these characters spawning in a game is low, made even lower by the fact that if they spawn too soon, they simply disappear. The attic and the cellar don't technically exist at the start until you have left the study. Or, as happens often, they just spawn too late. As your team of hapless investigators attempt to take down the Ghoul Priest, the Flesh Eater suddenly turns up in the attic. This is a rare example of where the VPU gain is perhaps randomly determined rather than based on effort alone. It is true, of course, that everyone gets 2 free experience points, but this could have been mitigated, I think, in a couple of ways. The obvious one would have been to give the Ravenous Ghoul a victory point for defeating him. He's pretty tough, and it's always a sad day when a hapless investigator faces off the Ravenous Ghoul for 0 victory points. The other way, of course, was addressed in the Return to the Night of the Zealot, which of course is to spawn the attic or the cellar when the ghouls are drawn and the investigators are still in the study. A welcome change to maximise victory points from random draws, but even so, the chances of drawing either are still small. The chances of drawing either ghoul is about 8% per turn, rising to 13% by turn 10. I haven't calculated the chances of drawing both true solo, but it's very small. Of course, playing with multiple investigators where you're drawing multiple cards from the encounter deck, of course, increases the chances significantly. But here's the rub, that means that for solo players, you're penalising them, and if anything, they're in need of more, not less experience points. This just seems unfair on true solo players. Speaking of victory points, the Ghoul Priest, he's no pushover, which is a compliment to the developers that they didn't make the Gathering a cakewalk. They inject genuine challenge for new players into the design. He scales up depending on the size of the party. He has Retaliate and requires a minimum of 6 strength and agility to comfortably fight or evade. It's more likely that, like me, a new player will be defeated on their first attempt at the gathering. And this is an important lesson in and of itself, because defeat is then understood to not mean the end. The game is teaching you that you can be defeated and still proceed to the next scenario. The end of most scenarios in Arkham Horror the card game do not mean the end of the campaign. This scenario is therefore a problem more for true solo players or those who've chosen investigators with relatively low fight values.
WingingIt highlights the challenge of taking down the Ghoul Priest with some excellent strategy tips. He says, as for the Ghoul Priest, some investigators will want to go and grab Lita. Others will just stand toe-to-toe with him. When you're teamed up, two-handed or multiplayer, having someone to go grab Lita can definitely help the main killer. Also, don't sleep on evasion to turn off his Retaliate. Make sure you are good and ready for the final fight when you advance. He's big and mean, so have your weapons loaded and boosts ready to give yourself the best shot of passing the fight tests. However, as we all know, for new players, things often don't go according to plan, as Kevling found out. He says, had a play of the Gathering with someone who had never played before. It's been ages, probably 18 months since I last played it, and I'd forgotten what a git the Ghoul Priest was. Indeed, he is Kevling. Unfortunately, it engaged him, Roland, as I, Wendy, ran off and tried and failed to parley with Lita. It left him stuck, unable to evade due to his stats and nothing in hand to boost it. And thanks to Roland's low sanity and GP's Retaliate, it finished him off pretty quickly.
This contrasts with a similar scenario. I was struck by this in The Circle Undone, The Witching Hour. Like the Gathering, investigators begin that scenario in a limited space from which they must investigate and find clues to spawn the final location, the Witch's Circle. To finish the scenario, investigators are given 2 choices at the Witch's Circle: defeat Annette or find all of the clues. Like the duality of the defeat parley as is used in the Ich-Taka encounter in The Forgotten Age, this provides some flexibility which is not present in the Gathering. Perhaps a mechanic whereby the Ghoul Priest could be defeated or evaded through a parley, or even if Lita could be parleyed from the hallway, might have made this scenario a little kinder to newer players or players with low fight values. The end of the scenario, of course, leaves the players in a sufficiently ambiguous place, as we've discussed already. Who is Lita Chandler anyway? What is her role in all of this? Was she the defender or starter of the whole thing? Either way, having Lita proves to be a valuable asset in more ways than one in subsequent scenarios. So, despite some small criticisms, the scenario design for the Gathering is excellent. It's easy to forget just what a great tutorial scenario it is, and the developers deserve huge praise for giving new players an excellent introduction to the game, which teaches the basics whilst giving new players a gradual and at the same time challenging exposure to the core mechanics.
Vase Odin, however, does make an excellent point about the Gathering, which is with newer, more complex scenarios, it doesn't feel like it teaches enough for someone whose first purchase after the core set is the Forgotten Age or Dream Eaters, as they have so many new mechanics. This is really an excellent point and makes me wonder whether there is some other opportunity for an introductory scenario which deals with these more complex mechanics.
This scenario also provides the basis for the fleshed out Return To version, which provides a greater challenge and corrects some of the frustrations in the original. And like the Midnight Masks, the Gathering represents an archetypical scenario which is reused and has been done many times since in subsequent campaigns.
It is the you must defeat the boss to proceed scenario, which we see in The Witching Hour, we see it in Blood on the Altar, and of course The Gathering, amongst many, a classic video game dynamic.
So that's quite a lot about the Gathering. So how did the different investigators, or how do they manage this scenario? Let's take a look. So here we have the league table from Season 1 of the Investigator games. It has all the current investigators on it, and they've all completed the gathering. And what's interesting, first of all, is just the sheer range of results from true solo play. And there are some other notable analyses here. 6 experience points from 4 victory points was not surprisingly the most popular outcome, and that represented 50% of the outcomes for these investigators. 4 experience points was the second most popular outcome, representing a further 26%. These are investigators who, of course, did not defeat the Ghoul Priest, but found all of the clues. Only 4 investigators, or about 12%, managed to get all the clues, defeat the Ghoul Priest and defeat an extra ghoul for that extra victory point, which is, of course, in line with the probability that these creatures show up about 8 to 13% of the time. 7 turns was the absolute fastest, managed by Diana Stanley, and Jenny Barnes was the slowest, taking a lazy 15 turns. Only 7 investigators, or 21%, gained Lita, and not surprisingly this is weighted towards Seekers. Looking at the different classes colour-coded on the left here, we can see that actually survivors have generally done the best. They're most likely to be top of the table, Calvin of course being a massive outlier, no surprises. Guardians also did pretty well, and we can see Seekers not so good. There's quite a lot of Seekers in that sort of mid-range. That's probably because of the needing to fight the Ghoul Priest in this particular scenario. Interestingly, Mystics were a mixed bag. They were the most polarized class, with some doing very well, like Diana and Akachi, but others not doing so well at all. So I suppose if the gathering is anything to go by, probably running a Survivor True Solo is likely, on average, if you like, to give you the best outcome. So that's about it for the gathering. So let's sum up. What's my verdict? Once players have learnt the game, the gathering is often forgotten as a scenario. It's often dismissed as too easy or lacking the complexity of later outings. However, I think we should all pause and just appreciate how great the gathering is in terms of fulfilling its really important role as an introductory scenario, not only to the first campaign, but Arkham Horror the Living Card Game as a whole. Like all great tutorial levels, it guides the new player through the core mechanics of the game in a step-by-step fashion, so by the end of the gathering, players will be familiar with the core gameplay. But this scenario is no cakewalk. It's challenging and engaging at the same time, and leaves players with a sense of achievement and a desire to know more and to play more. This is echoed by Vase Odin of Twisted Tentacle when he says the scenario is short, which is a great way to learn the game and test out a deck. Although it's a tutorial, it doesn't pull any punches. The uncontrollable variable of the encounter deck can be devastating if the Mythos phase decides to be unkind. And Kevling mentions something similar when he says, still, it's a well-constructed introduction to the game. You're stuck in your study, investigate to find a way out. Now you have the hang of that, now learn about moving around. Right, now it's time to chuck some enemies at you, and now here's a boss. Lost in Time and Space says, often introductory to tutorial portions of games feel oversimplified for the purposes of empowering the player. In Arkham, however, things are different. It's a race between the players and the sinister forces culminating underneath their house. And it's a contest not many triumph over in their first try. In this way, the gathering is an excellent first scenario. It walks the line between accessible and complex, between achievable and challenging, and importantly leaves players wanting more. For these reasons alone, its development and design should be applauded. And I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for watching my analysis. I welcome your comments and thoughts. A special thanks, of course, goes to Fantasy Flight Games, from which most of the images I used here are sourced, unless said otherwise. And a special thanks goes to all of the contributors and their excellent thoughts. So a great big thanks to Vase Odin and his channel Twisted Tentacle Nate Lost in Time and Space, Bigstupidgrin, Kevin Evans and WingingIt, and thank you all of you for your thoughts. Please check out their channels. Their content is amazing and I watch them all the time. Vase and Nate also are on the Great Old Ones podcast, and links to all this excellent content is in the notes. Please subscribe early and often to all of them. Finally, a big thanks to all of you, the viewers. The channel is close to 2 years old. I never imagined we'd get this far. It's all thanks to you, and here's to another 2 years of Out of Ammo, Out of Time, and the Investigator games. I'm Krabby Terror 8, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.